I'd like to prepare us for Dr. Ashley Bogan. She is our General Secretary to the General Commission on Archives and History, an agency of the United Methodist Church. We are so excited you're here. And as she begins to prepare to come, I want to introduce you all to a West African word or West African image called Sankofa. Maybe some of you are familiar with Sankofa, the bird there. Basically what Sankofa means is it means to go back and fetch it and bring it forward. The images that you're looking at, the heart, if you could put them back up again, the heart there was a symbol that was found on a coffin in Lower Manhattan back in 1999-ish, around that time, as they were building the Weiss Federal Building. They encountered a slave burial ground. And on top of the coffin, there was that heart symbol. And so sometimes you will see that symbol on particular things in culture, and it basically means the same as the bird image, which means Sankofa, and they both mean to go back and fetch it and bring it forward. If you look at it, the feet of the bird are moving forward. Its head is turned back, and it's plucking, it looks like, an egg of wisdom from behind its wing. Some call it an egg, and some call it a gem. And what that bird is doing is reaching back into the past, getting that egg, that wisdom, that jewel, to examine it in the present so that it can keep marching forward, because it doesn't stop. And it doesn't stay in the past or stay in a nostalgic state. It continues to move forward with the wisdom that it can gain. And it also means that there is no shame in going back to get who we are. We have to know who we are as we move forward. We have to go back and get our rich heritage as United Methodists. And so Dr. Bogan is going to take us there. I had an opportunity to meet her in Chicago, and it was on. After she got done, I tracked her down, and I was like, oh, you got to come to the conference. And we made arrangements, and it happened. And Todd was a big part of that as well, and we are so excited to have you here. And I know I'm not even going to say what I know you're going to say, because I can't wait for you to say it, because I want the t-shirt. Amen, amen. So we want to give a warm welcome to Dr. Ashley Bogan, and if you will come, you can come around this way. We'll get you on stage, and so let us give her a warm welcome.
Greetings, Louisiana. How are y'all doing this afternoon? Good. Thank you, Bishop Williamson, for the invitation to speak with you all today, and a very, very big congratulations to you, not only on your recent degree, but on the fact that you became a bishop and a doctor within the same 6 months. That is quite the accomplishment, so congratulations. It is an honor to be amongst all of you here this afternoon to lead us in a teaching session on how our past can help us envision a more equitable future. For today's talk, I'm going to focus on two foundational aspects of Wesleyanism that will help us reclaim our heritage as United Methodists. First, I want us to reclaim our Wesleyan heritage through an examination of Susanna Wesley's rebellious nature and her influence on her son, John. Second, I want us to see how Susanna's spirit was renewed through John's submission to be more vile and his subsequent revolutionary ideas of systematic missiology. And I'll conclude with a hopeful message that calls all of us to revive our spirit as United Methodists towards these bold actions of our founders, and helps us be willing to think creatively about how we do church today, but especially how we do church in the future. I truly believe that if we want to be vital again as the United Methodist Church, we have to reclaim this heritage. And in order to reclaim it, we have to take a deeper dive into what it actually was. a tradition of bending the rules, of being ridiculed, or of doing the unthinkable. All of these in order to spread the love of God to the most people. So now, y'all, any good history starts with the stories of women. Any proper Methodist history starts with the story of Susanna. The mother of John, Susanna Wesley, was formidable. At the age of 19, she married Samuel, who was a priest in the Church of England. She gave birth to 19 children. 19 children. Being raised in a dissenting household, Susanna was a bit skeptical of the Church of England. Her skepticism and her strong will she passed on to her children. And quite famously, Susanna taught her daughters to read before she taught them how to sew. Of this abnormal act, she wrote, quote, "The putting children to learn sewing before they can read perfectly is the very reason why so few women can read fit to be heard and never to be well understood." Now, the most illustrative story of this strong will of Susanna took place in 1712. Samuel had traveled to London to fulfill his duties as a priest in the Church of England and was attending convocation, kind of like y'all are attending an annual conference right now. In his place at St. Andrew's, he left his curate in charge, a man named Inman. Susanna believed Inman to be a buffoon at best. In order to ensure the continued spiritual care of the persons of Epworth, she began to invite friends, her servants, her children, anybody who would come to her home after church on Sunday afternoon. Many of those living in town quickly began to share Susanna's sentiment and began to choose her services over the official ones on Sunday morning. From her kitchen, she was soon preaching to over 200 people each Sunday. Now, Inman was quite insulted by this, and he wrote to Samuel, and Samuel wrote to Susanna, and inquired what was going on. An inquiry which Susanna dared to challenge. She insinuated that she would only cease preaching if Samuel demanded that she did. And Samuel knew better. Now, John Wesley was about 8 or 9 years old when this happens, when he sees his mother preaching to hundreds from her kitchen. And from his mother's example, he realized that to truly reach people, sometimes you have to bend the rules. Sometimes to welcome people into the love of God, you have to do some unsanctioned actions. And many of these need to occur outside the walls of a church. It is in, from, and through Susanna's influence that John begins to claim a sense of what I'm calling Wesleyan vitality. This is an ideology that I believe is at the heart of Methodism, and one that over the last couple of centuries we've lost. Wesleyan vitality is that willingness to look beyond today's acceptable practices, standards, and norms, and bend those rules just a bit to ensure that more and more persons can be included within the kingdom of God. It ensures that all persons, no matter who they are, how they identify, whom they love, or how they live, can know and experience the love of God, can know their own self-worth, and can grow to love themselves so that they can love others. Susanna preached a prophetic offense by simply embodying a female body and daring to preach in the 1800s. But she did so, or in the 1700s, but she did so because she knew that there were persons in need of a message of God's love, and fulfilling that commandment of God is greater than any offense that one might cross. Now, John soaks this in, and it first comes out in his days at Oxford. When the moniker Methodist begins to be used, it described a group of 4 to 5 people, some students, some fellows, but all at Oxford. Now, John Wesley had already graduated, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with his life. So he was that awkward alum who kind of hangs around, tries to feed off the energy of the current students, and his brother Charles had just enrolled. Charles had just begun this pietistic, Bible-centric group on campus. And now John, being John, took it over from his brother. The group quickly began to be ridiculed for their peculiar method of doing religion. They rose early, they studied scripture intently, they prayed incessantly, they fasted, they talked openly about their spirituality, they visited the sick, they held each other accountable to all of this. In other words, they centered their lives on faith as love acted out. And y'all, this was weird. Most people back then, if they went to church or were welcomed into a sanctuary, sat down, listened to some scripture, hopefully stayed awake through a sermon, and then left. There was no action required of them except filling a seat in a pew on Sunday mornings. And even then, that privilege was reserved for a select few. Those who had the proper dress to enter sanctuary, those who had access to a parish, or those who had the luxury to take the Sabbath off from their labors. The idea of faith existing beyond the walls of a church was anathema. The idea of faith being something that was lived, acted out, embraced, embodied, that began to challenge the status quo. At a place like Oxford, it wasn't only the prior named disciplined acts of social transgression that made these Methodists weird. It was also their willingness to break the political norms of the day. Very often, they would leave the walls of the city of Oxford and go out beyond them to where the people were, to where the poor were, the outcast, the imprisoned. And they not only breached those walls, but they transgressed the religio, political, and social boundaries of whom was deemed worthy of God's love. They began to preach to these folks, to minister with them, to ask them what their spirits needed. And John and his friends were called many things for this peculiar way of faith. Names such as Bible moths, sacramentarians, and the Holy Club were tossed around to describe them, and all with a derisive tone. In the past few years, British Methodist historian Peter Forsyth has found what he believes to be the earliest written, published use of the term Methodist to describe John Wesley and this group. It was printed in an Oxford newspaper in 1732 in reference to John Wesley's ministry with a particular inmate, Thomas Blair. Now, most of the time, Wesley and his pals took food, drink, medicine, and reading materials to those imprisoned. Once per week, they would pray with them, and once per month, they would hold a full religious service for them. When they saw inhumane treatment directed at those who had no other options before them, the Holy Club took it upon themselves to hold the authorities accountable. But every now and then, their actions went further, and they began to experiment with legal advocacy on behalf of a select few. In 1732, this is particularly striking in Mr. Blair's case because he was on death row and accused of the alleged crime of sodomy. Now, many of us have heard this term before, but in the 18th century, it was a catch-all for any sexual act that did not lead to conception. Wesley and his friend John Clayton believed that Mr. Blair was being victimized by his fellow inmates, and they sought to ensure his protection and his humanity. Clayton and Wesley took a particular interest in his trial, and they began to marshal his evidence and sought to ensure that the case would convince any reasonable person of his innocence. The day of his trial, Wesley rose at 4 a.m. and rode 12 miles on a horse to be present. Unfortunately, Mr. Blair was found guilty in court, but his life was spared. Perhaps because of Wesley's intervention, but who can say for sure? What we can say for sure is that John Wesley was deemed guilty in the public's eye through association with, and particularly defense of, Mr. Blair. Now, I'm not saying that John Wesley was defending the actions of Mr. Blair, but he was also not condemning him for them. Wesley was concerned with how he was being treated by others. He knew that Mr. Blair, for this crime that was reportedly too indelicate to mention, would be targeted for multiple forms of harassment and unfair treatment. And Wesley knew that was wrong. In order to ensure that Mr. Blair felt worthy of God's love, of the love of a neighbor, and of love of himself, Wesley was willing to risk it all. Forsyth describes this unrelenting, unconditional defense of all persons as the public witness, the act of public witness that, quote, tipped the balance between the Methodists being tolerated and being castigated. After their defense of Mr. Blair, the Holy Club was ridiculed even more for their way of doing religion, for their method that upended the norm and bent the rules by living out the love of God through intentional outreach to those most in need. Powerfully, Forsyth declares, quote, Wesley and his Oxford's friends' eccentricities might be tolerated. Their excessive religious observance, their closed group intensity, their self-denial and strict code of living reminiscent of some of the wayward Puritan sects of the previous century. Even their lowering themselves to undertake good works in the prisons and workhouses was not beyond the pale. But it seems that when they took up the advocacy of a man accused of sexual crimes, they crossed the boundary between the bizarre but tolerable to the reprehensible. Now, in 2023, as a person discerning what it means to be Methodist, what it means to be United Methodist, I find it striking that we do not know this story. The article that is printed in the Oxford newspaper, which ridiculed Wesley for his defense of Blair, was the first time that the word Methodist is written in a public setting to describe John Wesley. Y'all, this is how we got our name. This is what it means to be Methodist. And this is the message of hope that we need to reclaim. After Oxford, John struggled with how to continue to live into this particular call. A few years later, on May 24th of 1738, John famously was assured of his faith walking down Aldersgate Street when he felt his heart strangely warmed. And while he was assured of God's love, he knew that he didn't want to just be a parish priest. Now, 2023 is not that different from John Wesley's day. Many of the people in the 18th century might have been considered nuns and duns. They were tired of the institutional church because it did not meet their everyday needs, and it refused to change in order to do so. People were expected to pay taxes to support the local church, but they did not see the local church supporting them. The national landscape of England was broken up into parishes, and for centuries, the parish system had functioned reasonably well. However, all of this came to an end during the Industrial Revolution. As communities transformed from rural farming and personal economies, millions of people abandoned their long-held family lands in search of seemingly lucrative industrial jobs. As a result of this, massive migrations exploded across England and up through Ireland and onto the North American colonies. Under this stress, the parish system quickly collapsed, and millions of persons were left without support systems. But this provided critical opportunities for those early Methodists to evangelize and expand as they filled in the gaps through care of the poor and the disenfranchised, through the establishment of hospitals and schools. From the very beginning, the itinerant commission demanded that we go to the collapsed places where life is most and was most vulnerable and disordered. This is now where the city of Bristol comes into play. Now, Wesley is called to Bristol, England, in the late March of 1739 by his longtime frenemy, George Whitefield. Whitefield had been in the city for a while, preaching to ever-increasing crowds, and he calls on John to assist. John arrives on March 31st and was astounded to find Whitefield preaching in the fields to thousands. He wrote in his journal, quote, "I could scarcely reconcile myself at first to this strange way of preaching in the fields." Now, up until this point, John had mostly followed at least the preaching standards of his day. Quote, "I had been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done inside of a church." By April 2nd, 2 days after his arrival, he does something he thought he never would. Quote, "At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in a ground adjoining to the city to about 3,000 people." Fellow Methodist historian Professor Ted Campbell recently analyzed various primary sources of Wesley's and concludes that John's preaching in the fields was not an in-the-moment movement of the Spirit, but was an intentional, well-thought-out vocational choice to be more vile. Campbell reminds us that it isn't simply John's preaching in the fields that went against the standards of the day. It's also his preaching within another diocese, one that's not his own, one without permission to preach in, that flat out broke the rules of the church. John was being transgressive, yet prophetic. Vile. Now, y'all who know me are probably rolling your eyes right now, but I truly believe that we have something to learn from Wesley's submission to be more vile. I recently spoke to a group of clergy persons at the Tennessee West Kentucky Annual Conference, and afterwards, I received an email from the pastor of Grace United Methodist Church in Jackson, Tennessee. Reverend Mary Beth Eberly called the action of Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey as vile, and related it to our Wesleyan sense, our Wesleyan vitality, our heritage, as to what we are called to do and be in this world. The young adults who listened were so inspired by this idea of Wesleyan vitality that they made a shirt for their upcoming beach trip. Vile, it's 4 o'clock somewhere. Dare I say it, y'all, if we want to be vital again, if we want to reach young people in new ways, if we want to revive, renew, reinvigorate, and reimagine our mission in this world, if we want to find hope in this moment, perhaps we need to first submit to be more vile. My colleague, David Worthington, who currently serves as the Director of Global Relationships at the New Room in Bristol, brilliantly states that while John Wesley's heart may have been strangely warmed in London, it was set afire in Bristol. Within 3 days of coming to Bristol, Wesley's entire framework of how to preach, where to preach, and what is proper versus what is missionally prophetic is wholly overthrown. This experience shook his foundational understanding of normativity, of acceptability, and replaced them with a desire to follow the Spirit of God and meet people where they were. This is Wesleyan vitality. And this submission to be more vile didn't end with John. When it comes to Wesleyan vitality, I'm often drawn to the words of Mary Bosanquet Fletcher. She preached often to large crowds despite her being a woman, and in the 1700s, she and Mary Ryan established Cross Hall, a Christian community which housed and educated children and destitute adults. Now, along with preaching and Bible study, they offered other services, many of them including medical care. And she is one of the first female preachers that John Wesley gives a license to. Of her own preaching, she stated, quote, "I am conscious how ridiculous I must appear in the eyes of so many for doing. Therefore, if some persons consider me an impudent woman and represent me as such, I cannot blame them. Besides, I do nothing but what Mr. Wesley approves. And as to reproach thrown by some on me, what have I to do with it but quietly go forward saying, I will still be more vile if my Lord requires it." In Louisiana, I've got some news for y'all. Y'all have been vile too. If you look at your own past, you've marked this moment as the time when Wesley's ministry truly began. In 1987, the History Task Group of the Louisiana Annual Conference commissioned Walter Vernon to write a history of Methodism in Louisiana. The published tome, entitled Becoming One People, is quite an exceptional examination of how Methodism came to and spread throughout this part of the South. One thing I found particularly striking when reading his history happened in 1838. Now, at this time, Louisiana was still technically part of the Mississippi Conference, and according to Vernon, for the 1839 conference, it was decided to, quote, "celebrate the first century of Methodism by holding rallies in each district and by taking subscriptions to erect and endow a new college, which would be named Centenary College." Now, I like to think that many of you are sitting here scratching your heads, trying to identify what happened 100 years prior to 1839. Hopefully, all sorts of dates are going through your head that you learned in confirmation class, Sunday school, seminary, or, in that wonderful Methodist history book that we all keep on our bedside table like good Methodists. Maybe you're trying to recall the quote-unquote official launching of a separate ecclesiological body called the Methodist Episcopal Church. Remember, this is when Wesley sanctioned the ordination of Francis Asbury, even though he technically didn't have the power to ordain. And this is when Methodism begins, right? Like, this is the 100 years that we're marking. But that was the Christmas conference, and that happened in 1784, and that's not 100 years prior to 1839. Now, I know I'm a historian, but I think I can do basic math. So let's think a little bit further back. Maybe you're thinking, all right, well, Methodism kind of really began before the Christmas conference. It began in the colonies that were still the British colonies, when Barbara Heck famously throws playing cards in a fire and demands that Philip Embry begin a Methodist class meeting. But that happened around 1766, and that's still not 100 years prior. So maybe, okay, let's go really far back. Let's go back to Wesley's day. Maybe it's John Wesley's excursion to Georgia, right? This has to be it. When right after his Oxford days, before his heart strangely warmed, Wesley came to Georgia and tried to minister with colonists and indigenous persons. And it famously went horribly wrong when he fell in love and then didn't know what to do with feelings. But again, that was 1732, and that's over 100 years. So what moment could we be marking? So the conference in 1839 determined the beginning of John Wesley's public ministry. Well, if you've been listening, 1739 is when John went to Bristol, preached in the fields for the first time, and submitted to be more vile. And if we look at the history of Centenary College in and of itself after it's established, it's also filled with stories of students and faculty embodying vitality. Ananias Freyer served as a janitor at Centenary College while it was located in Jackson, Louisiana. Though enslaved, the students of Centenary took a particular interest in him and began to share their education with him. Now, in the 1850s, educating enslaved persons went against the law, but the students knew that education could lead to liberation. And soon after, Freyer began preaching to fellow enslaved persons. Now, after the Civil War, a missionary conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church was established here in Louisiana, and Freyer approached a Methodist preacher and is finally formally licensed in 1868 to serve in Jackson. He died rather quickly after being licensed, but did manage to begin building a church there. His obituary states, quote, "Brother Freyer was a good preacher, a sound Methodist, and of pure, unblemished Christian character. He had the confidence, the love, and the esteem of the entire community in which he lived and died. Still, the Magnolia Church at Jackson is and will continue to be his monument, and as long as its sweet-toned bell shall continue to ring from Sabbath to Sabbath, it'll ring out its invitations to the people to come up to the house of the Lord. It will awaken in the minds of the whole community sweet memories of Ananias Freyer," end quote. And this vile spirit continued on throughout Louisiana's history, through persons like Louisiana's own Miss Carolyn Elizabeth Merrick. Carolyn was married to a rather prominent judge in the mid-19th century. She was raised Methodist, and her daddy was one of those who sought to financially support the founding and building of Centenary College. Caroline carried on that Wesleyan sense of pushing the boundaries, and her story reminds me a lot of Susanna. Right after the Civil War, she became quite active in the advocacy of women's right to vote. In fact, she was one of only 3 women in the entire state to ever speak publicly for women's right to vote. Eventually, she served as the president of the local New Orleans Women's Christian Temperance Union for 10 years. And in this role, her advocacy garnered the attention of Frances Willard. Now, Frances Willard was serving as the president of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, and at the time, this was the largest women's organization in the entire United States. Caroline managed to get Frances to agree to come and speak at Carondelet Street Methodist Church in New Orleans in the 1890s. When Frances arrived to speak, she walked straight up to the pulpit, took her spot, and started talking. The bishop at the time was J.C. Keener and was so astounded by this act that he got up and left. But not all were offended by Willard's being a woman and speaking from the pulpit. Caroline was recorded in the Louisiana Journal saying, quote, "Thus at the New Orleans Methodist Church, that indomitable pioneer of reform proclaimed all hail to Frances Willard and her glorious cause." Louisiana Wesleyan vitality lives on and through you, through your stories, your histories, and God willing, it'll live into your future. Now, I want to pivot us and go back to John Wesley for this concluding section. So after Bristol, John Wesley develops this new ecclesiology for the people called Methodist. They were going to do church differently. But how? How do you actually go about doing church differently? Around 1745, John Wesley wrote a treatise entitled Advice to the People called Methodist. And it is through these words of Wesley that we can learn of his hopes for his people. And I think these 5 pieces of advice speak volumes to us today and would work well as the background of a conversation as to how we, as United Methodists, shape our future moving forward. Now, for context, Wesley was trying to piece together a unified missional movement in the midst of mass chaos as to who was Methodist and who wasn't. Sound familiar? He began this treatise with an acknowledgement that there were many people out there identifying as Methodist, but they didn't necessarily align with his understanding of faith acted out as love and the all-inclusive love of God. Sound familiar? Over the next few pages, he advises his people, called Methodists, those who profess to pursue holiness of heart and life. He advises them of 5 things. 1, you are a new people. 2, do not imagine that you can avoid giving offense. 3, trust God with your all, then go on in the power of God's might. 4, keep in your path and be true to your principles. And finally, not to talk much of what you suffer. How might the United Methodist Church take John Wesley's advice from 1745 and apply it towards our future? Well, we could be a new people. We have an interesting opportunity now to pivot and reclaim ourselves as new. In our past splits and mergers, it seems clear that we rarely took advantage of these transitional moments to really figure out who we are and to boldly and proudly proclaim that Wesleyan identity. Think back to the dozens of splits that happened in the first 50 years of the Methodist Episcopal Church. When the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Methodist Protestants, the Wesleyan Methodists, I could go on and on. When all of these groups chose to leave the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church didn't change. It refused to change out of fear of losing more members. And when you let numbers drive mission, the mission is hopeless. We have before us now a moment to be hope-filled, to rethink who we want to be in the future. We have a chance to be proactive, to be prophetic, to be vile. The question is, are we brave enough to do it? And this is where Wesley's second piece of advice comes in handy. We have to remember to not be afraid to offend people. John Wesley and those at Oxford were given many monikers for that weird way of doing religion, but the name that stuck with them was Methodist. And we need to remember that we cease to be Methodist when we forget that our name was at first an insult. Not everyone is going to like who we are or what we are doing, but we have to be willing to make people uncomfortable, to open ourselves up to critique, because the love of God compels us to be weird, to experiment, to do things that others wouldn't, and to love people who others say aren't worthy of it. John Wesley was often disparaged in his day. People who joined the Methodists were often disowned from their families. They were seen as an absurd, ridiculous group. They didn't gamble, they didn't drink, they didn't attend the theater, and they walked around talking about universal salvation. They visited the sick and the imprisoned. They prayed incessantly. They let women preach. They mixed genders in secret meeting rooms, and they critiqued slavery at the height of the Atlantic slave trade. All of this was quite offensive to the majority of 18th century England. But good Lord, what an example they were. How can the United Methodist Church reclaim this type of prophetic offense? How can we dare to love God and spread God's love in such ways that it just irks people to their core. What if we were to praise persons who dared to do ministry differently? Persons who were willing, as the late and great John Lewis said, to get into good trouble. What stances should we take publicly that will get people talking about us, even protesting us? Now here, Wesley's third and fourth pieces of advice offer comfort. The Lord does not ask us to do anything that we cannot do, because God is always with us, and anything is possible with God. And all of this strife, struggle, and ridicule will be worth it, because in the end, we will be living a life of inward and outward holiness. And finally, Wesley advises his people to not complain, to not suffer openly about their ridicule, and to not condemn those who offer critique. Good Lord, could we use this message? What this denomination is experiencing right now is not easy, nor should it be. We should all take a moment to grieve United Methodism as we've known it. But we also need to intentionally let ourselves dream, prophesize, and hope. And we have to do it by changing the conversation. Now, to conclude, I want to get a bit personal. I want to share one of the reasons that I stay United Methodist. Both of my parents were ordained clergy persons in the United Methodist Church. My mother was an ordained deacon for over 20 years, and my father an ordained elder for over 40 years. Both served the Arkansas Annual Conference. I don't stay United Methodist because it is how I was raised or because it is easy. Growing up in Arkansas, many of my friends did not know that women could preach. We heard in the retiree video that sentiment rings true everywhere. And I didn't know, though, that other denominations didn't allow women to preach. My mother was a preacher. Most of the bishops I remember interacting with were women. It never crossed my mind that women couldn't or shouldn't preach. And I fully credit that to being raised United Methodist. So the main reason I stay United Methodist is because of this foundation, this heritage. It is full of stories of faithful persons who lived out their faith through bold acts of love, which sometimes compel us to push boundaries and bend the rules. And y'all, we are a unique tradition. Our books of discipline, all of them, start with the historic narrative of who we are. We are rooted in our past, and if we are brave enough, we can grow new sprouts, new blooms, and new fruits that bear witness to our heritage. In order to do so, we also have to recognize that history is not in the past. History is now. History should be living and breathing in and through us. It should be informing how we shape our futures, which questions we ask, and what conclusions we concoct. Our job today in this room is not to set up the United Methodist Church for today or even for tomorrow. Our job is to set the stage for the United Methodist Church 100 years from now. In 100 years, I don't want our future generations to think, wow, in 2023, they really had a shot to proclaim who they were if they only took it. No, how do we get them to say, oh my goodness, during a global pandemic, during disaffiliations, during warfare, climate change, economic injustice, and a global racial reckoning, in the midst of all of this, those United Methodists in 2023, they sought to be new. They sought to be different. They sought to embrace their Wesleyan roots as vile persons who compelled others towards inward and outward holiness, who lived their faith through radical acts of love. Those United Methodists, they set the stage for us to continue to reach beyond the walls and embrace those on the margins. Those in 2023, they were the true spirit of Wesley living in, through and among us. We have that opportunity. It is a difficult one, but it is a possible one to reclaim that heritage, to revive the Spirit of God working in and through us, and to renew those inside and outside of our churches. Y'all, if we want to be vital again as the United Methodist Church, we must first be willing to do the unimaginable, to preach in new fields, to dare to risk, to dare to fail, dare to be ridiculed and the talk of the town. If we want to be vital again, y'all, we've got to submit to be, knew y'all were listening. We've got to submit to be more vile. And it's up to all of us to join together, hand in hand, in what lay ahead in our hopeful future. Thank you.